Welcome back. This video is the second of 3 for our sermon for March the 29th. It contains point number 2. Now, to remind you of where we are and where we've been, our text is Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, and our theme for this sermon is continue to conform your life to the gospel. In point number 1, we saw Paul urging the Philippians to work out their salvation with fear and trembling because it was God who's at work in them. And here in point number 2, we're going to be discussing what it looks like to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Look with me again at our text, beginning in verse 14. Paul says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life." Now, those words bring out a nuance that maybe we've been missing to this point in the book. When something comes up in one of Paul's letters once, we might notice it and then pass by. When one data point is there, it's just that, one data point. But when you begin to line up data points, then a trajectory appears. These verses are a part of a trajectory that we haven't talked about much, but we're going to begin to talk about more as the book of Philippians unfolds. The overall tone of the book of Philippians is overwhelmingly positive, but there are some indications that there are some problems in the church in Philippi. Why did Paul, way back in chapter 1, feel the need to exhort them to abound all the more in love? Why did Paul feel the need to mention that there are people who are preaching the gospel but with the false motives of trying to inflict damage to Paul, even if the gospel that they preached was correct? Why was there such strong teaching on humility and being others-centered at the beginning of chapter 2? And now here, we hear Paul say, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing." Well, that's 4 data points. A trajectory has been mapped out, and now a picture is beginning to emerge. While the church in Philippi was, for the most part, a healthy one, evidently they have an issue with unity. Evidently they, and you and I here and now, need to be reminded to reject pride and to walk in humility. Evidently, we need to be reminded to treat one another according to love and not foster a culture of infighting. Do all things, Paul says, without grumbling or disputing. Now, what's so surprising about this little section of text is that Paul is highlighting this command that he just gave, to do all things without grumbling or complaining. He's doing that as an example of what it means to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's the immediate context. That's a stunning application. We might think that a bit of bickering is just that. It's a bit of bickering. We might think that a bit of grumbling is just that. It's a bit of grumbling. But Paul is telling us here that kind of behavior is antithetical to gospel living. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or complaining. Continue to conform your life to the gospel. Let me give a picture that might help us. The words that Paul is using in this passage for grumbling and complaining, they're fairly rare in the New Testament, but they show up in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. They show up in the Septuagint pretty frequently when the text is talking about Israel and the wanderings in the desert. So here's the idea. God has, in breathtaking and miraculous fashion, unleashed the plagues on Egypt, brought his people Israel out, led them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He opened up the Red Sea and then collapsed it again on the Egyptian army. The Israelites saw all of these things. And their response, as often as not in the text, was to grumble against God. That's a ridiculous response. To bring the full point here, Paul is using this language because he seems to have those wilderness wanderings in mind. This is the effect. Jesus Christ became a man. Having become a man, he took on the form of a servant. Having taken on the form of a servant, he became obedient even to the point of death on a cross. And then he defeated death for all of us and has been raised to the highest place and been given a name that is above every other name. And our response is to act in a way other than humility. Our response is to treat each other badly, grumbling and complaining. That's what Paul is driving at. That kind of response, grumbling and complaining, is absurd in a believer given the gospel. It's not a good look, church. Instead, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or complaining. Now, the result of doing all things without grumbling or complaining, it's laid out for us in verse 15. Look there. So that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. In other words, grumbling and complaining, that's normal human behavior in a broken and a fallen world. That's what we expect people to be like apart from Christ. What Paul is calling us to is not the normal human response. In fact, what Paul is calling us to is a supernatural kind of living that is only possible precisely because it is God who is at work in us for his good pleasure. And so when you and I live our lives without this grumbling and complaining, but when you and I live in humility with an others-centeredness and in praise of our Lord, who has been given the name that's above every other name, when we do that, we shine like lights in the darkness. We show or prove ourselves to be children of God. That's what it looks like to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And to push a little bit further and dip into the first half of verse 16, we show that we're not taking our cues from the world at all. Rather, we're taking our cues from the gospel itself. That is, I believe, what Paul is intending when he says, holding fast to the word of life. A life that's lived in humility to the glory of God, working out our salvation with fear and trembling, showing that it is God who is at work in us, living free of grumbling and complaining. That kind of life, that is a life that is animated by the word of life, the gospel. Continue to conform your life to the gospel. And that, dear brothers and sisters, brings us to the end of point number 2. We'll see you in point number 3.